Good morning to everyone online. My name is Nogwanda Masego. I am a senior economist at TIPS, and I will be moderating this session on industrial policy and structural transformation in Africa. I hope everyone can hear me clearly.
We can.
All good, Ops.
All right. Thank you. All right, so this session is going to have 4 speakers. The first one is going to be Daniel Ludiwa, who is going to be talking about industrial development in Africa, which is a study that focuses on domestic and global constraints. And then the second one is going to be Abel Gaia, who's going to be speaking to stretching the developmental state. Our third speaker is going to be focused on technology transfer from university into and how that can be used as instruments for industrial development on the continent. And that would be Lodrina Masiazi. And our last presenter is going to be focused on logistics performance and industrial growth in Africa and whether human capital matters. And that will be Ade Soji. Farah Yibi, I apologize if I have mispronounced your names. So I will not be reading through the bios. I think those were made available to everyone. And in the interest of time, I think let us jump straight to the first presentation. Just to note for everyone, again, we have 12 minutes per presentation, and we will take the Q&A at the end of all 4 presentations. So Daniel, do you want to take us forward? All right, Daniel, I think let's end with you while we try to fix your tech issues. Abel, can you please jump in for us and do your presentation? Again, you have 12 minutes, so at 18 minutes to, I will ask you to stop your presentation.
All right, thank you, everyone. So I'll be speaking on the notion of stretching the developmental states. So within the development literature, it is well known that first industrial policy is a must if you want to undergo structural transformation and economic diversification. And traditionally, in the 1980s and 1990s, developmental states literature emerged to show the East Asian developmental states, as Thomas Johnson called them, driving this process. Subsequent theoretical assessments by Peter Evans and others regarded this as emerging from what he called embedded autonomy. So combining embeddedness of the states or a pilot agency within the informational substream of private sector interests with autonomy from political or distortionary political interference. And then eventually the political settlements framework has gone deeper into that to demonstrate that the distribution of power within society influences or shapes the degree to which a developmental state emerges. And in African societies, in developing countries in general, clientelist politics dominate, but then the extent to which developmental orientation occurs is influenced by the dispersion of power within society. So in African countries, it tends to be a greater dispersion of power. The PolSet data set that has attempted to measure political settlements across 44 countries in the global south shows that sub-Saharan African countries tend to have higher levels of dispersion of power on average. And so when you have such dispersions of power, it becomes ruling coalitions find it more difficult to focus on long-term programmatic developmental issues because much of their attention is directed towards short-term survival. And okay, so this cuts across three traditions. So the pockets of effectiveness literature then shows that you don't need state capacity in terms of broad-based bureaucratic capabilities across multiple ministries or agencies of a state, but that once the mutual interest between the ruling coalition and capitalists, productive capitalists emerge, there is then increased pressure for an incentive by the ruling coalition to create bureaucratic pockets of effectiveness to drive industrial policy. And then technological capability theory then talks about, or at least in this case, how the productive capacity and adaptive capabilities of firms enable the transformation of industrial policy rents into productive outputs and learning for productivity, but also that the nature of the sector or industry makes it more feasible for industrial policy success in certain ways. And with diversified business groups in dispersed political settlements where there's also a lot of macroeconomic and industrial policy volatility, business conglomerates may emerge in order to adapt, so to diversify risk by diversifying, engaging in vertical integration and horizontal integration, economies of scope and all that, in order to reduce exposure to a single industry. Next, please. So this case study will be focusing on Nigeria, where there is a high degree of dispersion of power. Ruling coalitions often face strong vulnerability to excluded coalitions, and within the ruling coalition, in order to maintain hold of power and prevent elites from leaving the coalition or to co-opt elites into the coalition, there is a lot of side payments, of the budget side payments and unproductive use of rent distribution in order to secure this. Next, please. So from the political settlements data sets by Schultz and Simkiosao, you'll see the categorization across various regions, and you see that for Nigeria, based on Khan's political settlements typology and the ACID typology based on the ACID Center at the University of Manchester, categorize Nigeria as narrow dispersed or competitive clientelism. So a large degree of dispersion of power compared to the sub-Saharan African average. So power is more dispersed on average in Nigeria, or has been for the past since 1960, since its independence, than the rest of sub-Saharan Africa. Next, please. So there are four cases that I'll be speaking about, but I'll just run through them quickly. They all emerged at a time of significant problems generally. So the Fourth Republic, Nigeria had just left the military regime and elected a new civilian president after an interregnum of military rulers. And by 1999, Nigeria had been ranked the most corrupt country in the world by Transparency International. There was a substantial fiscal crisis. Oil prices had been down, and there was a risk of exclusion from the global financial system. And there was a lot of debts that the federal government had, which had driven the debt crisis of the 1980s and 1990s. So across fiscal, economic, financial, and political dimensions, Nigeria was in a state of crisis. And so the federal government needed significant reforms in order to shore up, first secure a debt write-off, and then shore up foreign direct investments and improve fiscal capacity. So this was the driver for creating the Economic and Financial Crimes Commission with the EFCC Act 2004, and creates the ICPC, which is the Independent Corrupt Practices Commission, but the EFCC had broader powers after it was seen that the ICPC did not have enough power to do the work it needed to do. So prosecution of grand corruption and mid-level corruption was what the EFCC then proceeded to do. For the Rural Electrification Agency, the problems of Nigeria's power sector were well known. Nigeria undertook continentally significant reforms in 2005. The Electricity Power Sector Reform Act. It had the largest electricity access deficit in the world. It modeled the Power Sector Reform Act upon that of India's. And there was a lot of, only about 20% of rural areas were electrified. So there was both significant problems on the grid segments of the electricity value chain and also the off-grid segments. And so the rural...
Sorry, Abel, please start wrapping up. You've got 2 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Next, please. The REA. So I'll just summarize that of the Dangote Group. Started off also in the same period, benefited from backward integration policies from the federal government into cement, and then built up the cement sector, benefited from a lot of markets, demand-driven profits increase or profit growth during the period, and then had the mass of capital to invest in the refinery sector, which is what the Dangote refinery is, completed just a few years ago. Next. So the primary proposition is that we have instances of stretching state capacity in quotes based on the interaction between state ministries that enter into adjacent domains and firms that make use of their own adaptive capabilities in order to extend their sectoral reach. So if you map this out on a 2x2 matrix with states and firms on one side, and then the intrasectoral and cross-sectoral on the other side, the instance of function creep in this case is a case where the EFCC became, because of the poor performance of industrial policy implementing agencies and the court system in prosecuting or enforcing industrial policy rents, the EFCC has been requested by industrial policy implementing agencies to look into industrial policy rents, even if it is beyond their domain. So the collection of development finance or subsidies or loans, infrastructure projects that have been abandoned by contractors, and various other cases, content
Abel?
development. Yeah.
Sorry, your time is up, unfortunately. Do you have maybe a summarizing sentence to conclude your presentation?
All right. So the basic gist is that both at the state level and at the firm level, when looking at industrial policy and state capacity, it is important to look at both um, beyond the concept of spillovers of pockets of effectiveness, but also at the ways in which agencies that are not traditionally within the industrial policy ambits creep into industrial policy ambits because of capacity gaps between the primary agencies and the creeping agencies. And then for the private sector, it's the adaptive capacity of the firms in adapting to weak or imperfect industrial policy, state capacity, in order to drive uh, uh, stronger industrial policy performance or outputs based on their own
Fantastic.
capabilities.
Thank you. All right, I think let's move on to the next presentation on technological transfer and public innovation hubs and industrial development. Lodrina, do you want us to share your presentation, or are you fine sharing it on your side?
I can try sharing it from my end.
All right, 12 minutes. May I maybe suggest that you just do your introduction of the paper and then move to the key points of the presentation?
Okay, I hope everyone can see my slides.
Yes.
So good day, everyone. And it's a pleasure and honor to be part of these proceedings. Thank you for the opportunity to share this presentation. Today, I'm just reflecting on a question that many African universities, especially here in Zimbabwe, are increasingly facing, which is more looking at how can universities move beyond generating knowledge and actively contributing to industrial development. My focus, of course, is mainly on technology transfer structures and innovation hubs. And it's also coming from the practical experiences of establishing and managing a technology transfer unit in a public university. So essentially, there's a paradigm shift that has occurred within the sector. You'll find for many decades, universities have largely been on the pillars of research, teaching, and community service. And probably for the past 2 decades, there's been a shift to now also add innovation and industrialization to that delivery in terms of universities. And largely in part for this shift in the case of Zimbabwe is looking at issues to do with industrial development, to say how can we ensure that industries that were dying are rebirthed, how can we enhance existing industries so that they are better performing, and also at the same time introducing new industries that traditionally were not part of our ecosystem. And it means there's now an expectation for the translation of knowledge into practical applications that can be utilized by universities. So this then comes to what I believe is the innovation ecosystem within which public universities and innovation hubs tend to operate. Your researcher and innovator is at the center of it, but there are a number of key players who come into the mix for the, success of the industrial development agenda. So you're looking at your corporates, your investors, your incubators, your government, and the university itself. However, there has been the challenge in the fact that these key actors in the ecosystem don't automatically collaborate. And normally there needs to be platforms in which this can happen. And this is where I see technology transfer units and also innovation hubs playing a critical role in that particular agenda. And how this is seen is by looking at innovation hubs as bridging institutions that connect researchers with industry. They are translating research, they accelerate commercialization, they support startups and technology development, and as well also providing infrastructure and mentorship. This is very key, and I think conceptually, this is understood, especially here in Zimbabwe with our various innovation hubs that have been established. But I think there are practical realities in terms of the implementation of these and how to manage such structures within a public sector. And this is where I'm probably just going to go into some reflections. So at the Harare Institute of Technology, it's a state university that is in Harare, Zimbabwe. And we had the mandate in 2005 to develop, transfer, incubate, and commercialize technology for the industrial development and progress of Zimbabwe. This led to, in about 2018, to the establishment of a technology transfer unit. It hasn't been a linear journey. There's been a lot of iterations. You'll find that from 2018 to 2021, there was the establishment of policies which have been going through a lot of revisions to try and also align with the macro environment in terms of what's happening nationally, regionally, continentally, globally, trying to benchmark against other technology transfer units that are there. There's the need for capacitation, and after building capacity, sometimes losing human resource to where they believe there might be greener pastures. So there's again a constant retraining, recalibration of just trying to ensure that the technology transfer capacity and capabilities are still within that particular unit. And from 2022 to 2026, it's really been practice trying to implement different things in an ecosystem where, from a policy point of view, like in the case of Zimbabwe, it's still very young. The understanding of how innovation works, its relation to academia, its relation to industry, is still a learning curve for most. And this has led to lessons learned, which contribute to that transformation of universities, innovation hubs, and tech transfer units into becoming industry developers. And principally, there are several factors. Mainly, there are three: institutional, operational, and ecosystem related. And in terms of the institutional, I think the most powerful for me has been having the leadership commitment. It's very important because there are a lot of things that technology transfer units face, especially in that paradigm shift of moving from the traditional manner of operations to now looking at industrialization. There are operational issues to then say there's need to be continuous capacity building. But I think the most impactful one is ecosystem-based, where we are saying this is from a partnerships point of view with industry. Industry engagement is really key. It has actually led to some of the success factors that we have experienced as an innovation hub. And you'll actually see and notice that when it comes to public innovation hubs, basically the same innovation pipeline is what is being looked at, from disclosure all the way to community or social or commerce and industry impact. And large in part, you find that there's need for the embedment of technical, business, and institutional roles. But this in itself still represents some challenges that can come along the way, because you'll find that fundamentally there are ongoing challenges that are within these ecosystems, especially those faced by public innovation hubs, where there's a still growing commercialization system in terms of intellectual property and technology transfer. There are infrastructure gaps, which I think previous speakers have already alluded to that, which can impact on it. There's increasing competition. Sometimes the very industry you're trying to collaborate with can see you as a competitor or a threat or to their business, because there's a lot of disruption that comes with the innovation process. But essentially, it's now trying to position innovation hubs to then say, we are here actually to support industry, to ensure that there's an ecosystem that is continuously thriving and being able to actually coexist and build our different economies. And I particularly enjoyed the presentation on the AFCFTA, because that is also something that's really relevant, taking on a regional approach in terms of how we approach innovation development is key. So looking at our innovation hubs, we are saying that the roles they play, it can actually play in terms of supporting industrial development, from how technology is being commercialized. For us here in Zimbabwe, particularly in the tech transfer unit that I am in, we have been able to translate certain innovations to the market, still national, but with the interest of expanding regionally, from your distribution transformers to your healthcare applications, software applications, looking at energy solutions that can actually help in transforming the country. I think it's very key to monitor metrics such as how many jobs are being created, how much revenue is being generated, how many partnerships with industry is actually taking place. So, and all this is part of technology commercialization. We've had entrepreneurship becoming a major drive as well, because from startup creation, there are spaces in which young innovators and even established researchers can then find ways of translating their technologies, their developments into the market, but innovation hubs are playing that role of providing that bridge. Industry collaboration has always been at the center of it, because without the support of industry, it's very hard to be able to translate anything. And industry collaboration is really key, because industrial development is at the end what really is holding up a lot of economies. And this is where it's necessary for us to keep that in mind. There's the technology diffusion, which is looking at how we can ensure that technology reaches to wider economies and wider audiences. And I think these kind of discussions is exactly what we need to ensure that there's continued growth. And as innovation hubs, providing such platforms is really key. And it would be great to also see a system where even innovation hubs within Africa are connecting with one another to ensure that there's that soft landing and continuous onboarding of new technologies. And then, of course, there's capacity development, where essentially we're looking at ways to ensure that we have the capability and capacity to do what is necessary to ensure that industrial development is taking place at the right pace and at the right time, and also ensuring that I like the focus of trying to ensure that from a country perspective, how is it actually impacting on the country? So in conclusion, I'll probably say my key reflection is I believe universities actually possess a lot of intellectual capacity and research potential, but there's always that challenge of how to translate that. And this is where innovation hubs, this is where technology transfer units can actually help in ensuring that that knowledge is moving into society and creating the kind of impact that we need. So thank you very much for listening to this presentation.
Thank you. You're right on time. All right, so let's move on to the next presentation on logistics performance and whether human capital matters. Again, it is 12 minutes, so at 12 minutes past 12, the presentation will stop. Thanks.
Yeah, yes, thank you. Greetings. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Well, thank you. So the presentation, good morning, and thank you for APORDE for this opportunity. The presentation is on logistics performance and industrial growth in Africa. Does human capital matter? Please, next slide, please. So on the introduction, Africa stands at a critical juncture in its economic development trajectory, facing persistent deficit in industrial growth. We have the manufacturing value added in Africa is about 11.5% of GDP. This is significantly below the 20 to 25% observed in Asia, according to the World Bank. Before, there are other opportunities for industrial transformation, such as abundant natural resources, a youthful and rapid urbanizing population, which creates a demographic dividend. We also have a growing middle class with increasing purchasing power. We have accelerated internet connectivity. And even just like Professor Fayez said, there's the leveraging the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, so that these are great opportunities for industrial development in Africa. On the next slide, it says, but despite these potentials, African industrialization trajectory still remains highly constrained by logistic infrastructure. Due to logistic weaknesses and these structural issues, we have an estimated annual loss of $170 billion in inter-regional trade, with about 50% increase in manufacturing costs. And when we look at the different framework of this logistic performance, we are talking about six different ones. We have the ability to track and trace consignment, the competence and the quality of logistics services, the ease of arranging competitively priced shipments, the efficiency of custom clearance processes, the frequency with which shipments reach consignee within scheduled or expected time, and the quality of trade and transport related infrastructure. So, however, focusing solely on physical infrastructure overlooks a critical component of the logistic industrialization networks, which is the human capital. Of course, human capital is very important, which is the workforce capability for optimization. Current understanding of this African industrialization has slightly treated logistic infrastructure and human capital as a separate policy domain. However, there's still need for human capital threshold to be able to harness this logistic infrastructure. And just like endogenous growth theory states, it said that human capital is the engine of sustained growth through knowledge spillovers and the adoption of technology. Even the absorptive capability theory also talked about how human capital assimilates, helps industrial firms to recognize and to enhance logistic knowledge and to be able to increase industrial development. So what is the research question that this study is focusing on? So what is the effect of logistic performance and human capital on industrial growth in Africa? And in that case, we have two main questions. We have how do logistic performance and human capital development affect industrial growth in Africa? And of course, what is the interactive role of human capital in mediating the relationship between logistic performance and industrial development in Africa? So, of course, the main objective is to analyze the roles of logistic performance and human capital in industrial growth in Africa. Our main contribution of course, it empirically shows whether or not human capital acts as a complement or otherwise in analyzing the impact of logistic performance in Africa. And secondly, we also want to look at the interactive role of human capital, because doing this will enhance the productivity of logistics system and facilitate technology adoption and innovation in industrial sectors, as endogenous growth theories and other theories have said. So what are the model? Build this model. We have two important models there. We have the direct effect model, direct effect of logistic performance and human capital on industrial growth. We also have the interactive effect model, which talk about the interaction of logistic performance and human capital on industrial growth. And on the methodology, the main preliminary test, when we look at particularly the scatter plot, what is the data saying, the raw data before the estimation, we found out that Tanzania, Cote d'Ivoire, and South Africa, they have relatively well-developed logistics system that supports more industrial activity than countries such as Niger, Burundi, and Ethiopia, which have a logistic constraint that have hindered industrial growth. Of course, because of the panel nature of the analysis, we are using the in-person and scene unit root test, and all variables are stationary at first difference. Of course, the estimation technique is the system GMM estimator, because it is appropriate for addressing heterogeneity and dynamic persistence and unobserved country-specific effects in panel data analysis. And what is our data? The sources, we cover 32 African countries over the period of 2007 to 2025, and data are gotten from the World Development Indicators. Now, on the main result, the first model talk about direct effect of logistic performance and human capital on human industrial growth in Africa. Looking at the results, we can see that all the 6 indicators of human of logistic performance, they have a negative, and before that, they even talk about the lag development variables of industrial growth. We find out that it's the coefficients are significant. This implies that previous industrial performance significantly influences current industrial outcomes. This is consistent with social transformation theories that posit that industrial development tends to follow a cumulative trajectory driven by capital accumulation, technological diffusion, and scale. However, due to structural rigidities, this empirical validity is still mixed because of some deindustrialization in Africa. However, so going straight to the 6 logistic performance indicators, we find out that all the 6 indicators that we have identified, they have negative and insignificant effects on industrial growth. Despite the importance of important potential of logistic infrastructure, the logistic infrastructure are not fully developed to influence industrial growth in Africa, because there are still some bottlenecks and transportation issues and some inefficiencies, which remain major constraints to accelerated industrialization on the continent. And if you look at the second one on the first model, human capital, the finding shows that the coefficient are negative, very interesting. They are negative but significant. That means there's a negative relationship between human capital and industrial growth in Africa. That is, increase in human capital reflects broader socioeconomic conditions rather than direct expansion of industrial sector. It implies that changes in human capital does not really translate into industrial growth, because somehow, due to economic structure, remains dominated by service sector and resource-based sectors. Perhaps that's what determines this. And if you look at other control variables, of course, electricity improves industrial sector, which is industrial activities, which is very germane. Electricity supply is very important for a fundamental requirement for industrial production. And also foreign direct investment on this one is not particularly significant. This implies that inflow of foreign capital is not tailored towards industrial growth in Africa. And of course, on the trade openness generally exhibits positive and significant insignificant effect, although it suggests that greater integration into international trade support industrialization by providing maybe access to large markets, important intermediate input, and technological division. On the second model, which has to talk
sorry,
about
Adesoji, you have a minute and a half.
Yes, I will. On the second model, just like you said, there's a mixed result between the amongst the logistics indicators. So we have 4 of the indicators are very germane to making to improving industrial growth in Africa, which is have negative relationship. However, 4 of the 2 of the indicators have a perfect effect. That is, we have the ability to track and trace consignment, the competence and the quality of logistics services, ease of arranging competitive price shipment, and the efficiency of clearance, custom clearance process. This still has a little issue in Africa. However, the frequency with which shipment and consignee schedules and the quality of trade when interacted with human capital is still able to get a lot of input, able to help. So what is this telling us? What is the main contribution of this of the result? We find out that on conclusion, we find out that the study says that direct and effective effect of logistic performance and human capital and industrial growth. Say 6 logistic indicators have positive but insignificant effect on industrial growth. However, human capital has a negative effect, whereas the logistic, the interactive effect has a mixed effect. So what's the conclusion? The result reflects that there are still structural characteristics of many African economies suggest that changes in human capital does not really translate into industrial growth because of the economic structure. We remain dominated by service and resource-based sectors. Therefore, policymakers should pursue coordinated investment in transport infrastructure, supply chain efficiency, and technical skill development, and workforce training to maximize industrial growth benefit of logistic performance in Africa, to be able to improve logistic performance across the African economies. Thank you.
Thank you, Adesoji. Rosal, how are we doing with Daniel?
So he's going to try again, and I'm going to project his screen.
All right, cool.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to the committee for hosting this conference and for the opportunity to share my work. My research explores the domestic and global constraints hindering industrialization and development in Africa. My goal is to discuss how we move the continent forward to a more resilient economic landscape. So despite decades of reforms, Africa continues to grapple with the challenges of industrialization. Our manufacturing sector remains very shallow. For example, Ethiopia's manufacturing as a percentage of GDP sits at around 5 to 7%, while China is near 28%. We are characterized by limited value addition and heavy reliance on primary commodities. My research examines why industrialization has failed to materialize, despite decades of state-led policies and market reforms. Next slide, please. I attribute these industrial failures largely to weak state capacity and the prevalence of rent-seeking elites. These factors undermine the conditions necessary for productive reinvestment and effective industrial policy. Understanding these internal dynamics helps explain the central puzzle of divergent parts, why nations like South Korea achieved rapid transformation while many African countries have not. Next slide, please. Standard variables like geography, infrastructure, or trade openness provide only a partial explanation. While the African Development Bank notes that infrastructure gaps raises indirect costs, and the UN points to fragmented markets, I've found that these explanations fall short. To assume industrialization is a technical problem, I argue that it is a structural power problem, and these technical views fail to account for the missing variables. Next slide, please. My research argues that understanding this divergence, we must look at the three specific variables, which are the missing variables. Firstly, we have class structure dynamics. In many commodity-dependent nations, the dominant class is the rentier elite rather than an industrial one. Secondly, we have a state capacity. This involves the technical and political ability of a government to implement complex and industrial strategies. And lastly, we have the existence of a disciplined industrial capitalist class. For industrialization to take root, a country needs a capitalist class that is disciplined by the state to move away from low-risk trading and into high-risk and high-reward manufacturing. A disciplined industrial capitalist class requires the state to solve the coordination failure in investment. In many African contexts, capital is rational but unproductive. It stays in the short-term trading because the profit is easy. Discipline means that the state changes that calculation. It's not just about giving subsidies, it's about making them painful to lose. This forced shift from easy rent seeking to difficult manufacturing is the engine of East Asian miracles that we have yet to ignite in sub-Saharan Africa. My inquiry is guided by three research questions. Firstly, does Africa possess a domestic industrial class committed to long-term investment? Are African states capable of effectively disciplining private capital? And lastly, can they implement a coherent policy that fosters sustained industrial transformation? Next slide, please. I draw upon the Arthur Lewis dual sector model, where development relies on the capitalist sector reinvesting profits into industry. I bridge this with the developmental state framework, work of Alice Amsden, that late industrialization requires reciprocal control, subsidies given only if firms meet performance standards. Robert Wade further provides the empirical weight here. In his study of East Asia, he found that states did not simply fix markets, they governed the markets by leading private investment into specific strategic sectors. Finally, Peter Evans provides the concept of embedded autonomy. This involves the state being connected to the private sector to understand its needs, but independent enough to discipline it. Next slide, please. To test my hypothesis, my study employs a mixed methods comparative design. No, please, can you go back to the previous slide? To test my hypothesis, the study employs a mixed methods comparative design. I used rollback data from 1960 to 2019 to track manufacturing as a percentage of GDP and GDP per capita across the 8 African nations. Ending in 2019 allows us to analyze long-term structural trends without the extreme noise and anomalies introduced by the global pandemic and subsequent supply chain shocks. The 8 African countries I analyzed are South Africa, Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, Egypt, and Tunisia. I then contrasted these with the trajectories of South Korea's historical record. Qualitatively, I analyzed the political economy of these regions to identify how class relations and state autonomy shape these quantitative outcomes. Next slide, please. The results from the data connected from the manufacturing value added as a percentage of GDP revealed a stark contrast in industrial deepening. In South Korea, manufacturing as a share of GDP rose steadily and peaked at 27% by 2019. This is not just growth, it is a sophisticated shift into a high-value production driven by strategic state intervention. However, in African country cases, most show stagnation or premature deindustrialization. For example, South Africa, once the continent's industrial powerhouse, saw its manufacturing share fall from 23% in the early 1990s to approximately 12.5% by 2019. Nigeria presents a classic case of Dutch disease. Its manufacturing share peaked at nearly 20% in the early 1980s, but collapsed to just 9% by 2019. Kenya, Ghana, and Uganda have remained stagnant, with industrial bases that are shallow and rarely break the 10 to 11% threshold. This suggests that despite rising GDP, the underlying structures of these economies remains unchanged. Next slide, please. You can find the points I just read. I just said now on this slide. Next slide. This slide shows the GDP per capita data, which results in a growth without transformation. From here, we can see that South Korea saw explosive growth. In 1960, their GDP per capita was a mere $147, and by 2019, it reached nearly $28,500. This was a direct result of productivity gains driven by industrial restructuring. African economies, however, show slow and uneven progress, often tied to commodity cycles. For example, while Nigeria's GDP grew during oil booms, it did not translate into a shift towards high-value activities. We see a rising income levels that remain vulnerable because they are not backed by an industrial foundation. This is the definition of growth without transformation, where rising numbers do not reflect a shift in the productive capabilities of the people. Next slide, please. The points can be read on the slide. Next slide. This shifts to our focus on trying to understand, why did South Korea succeed where Africa stalled? The core of my argument is rooted in the nature of the class that assumed power. South Korea successfully cultivated an industrial capitalist class. Through land reforms, they dismantled the old landed elites, forcing capital into industry. The state then used reciprocal control mechanism, subsidies, and credits only given to firms that met export targets. Subsidies and states played a huge role in ensuring a firm achieving measurable performance benchmarks. Domestic industries received temporary protection from international competition, allowing them to mature and become competitive. In many African nations, post-colonial states often shifted towards neo-patrimonial politics rather than industrial growth. Instead of a developmental coalition, these became fragmented states where elites extracted wealth from state contracts and natural resources to maintain political loyalty. Because the state lacked the autonomy to discipline these groups, resources were used for patronage rather than being reinvested into manufacturing. When contracts are awarded based on political gatekeeping rather than productive capacity, the incentive to innovate vanishes, leaving the industrial base stagnant and even during economic booms. Next slide, please. Tying back to our theories, we can see that in Africa, surplus labor does exist, but profits are not reinvested. Secondly, where states fail to discipline elites, it results in stagnation. There is no states and capital alliance. Next slide, please. The primary takeaway is that Africa's industrial problem is not merely technical. It is political and class-based. To move forward, we must address the elite discipline gap before designing technical industrial policy. I recommend firstly we move towards strict conditionality. This involves all state support, whether credit, subsidies, or protection, must be contingent on measurable reinvestment and expert performance. If a firm fails to meet these benchmarks, the state must have the autonomy to withdraw support immediately, ending the cycle of a perpetual infant industry. Secondly, we need to actively cultivate an industrial capitalist class. This means using licensing and credit as a carrot and stick, rewarding those who invest in manufacturing while aggressively penalizing speculative rent-seeking. And lastly, we need to rebuild state capacity with a focus on enforcement. It is not enough to have an industrial agency. That agency must be insulated from political interference and empowered with the monitoring tools necessary to discipline capital and ensure that surplus is reinvested into a domestic economy. To conclude, industrial policy success depends entirely on the political environment. My research shows the gap between the Asian tigers and Africa isn't about the amount of investment, but the discipline of capital. We cannot treat all investment as equal. Africa doesn't just need a state to facilitate business. It needs a state to discipline the progress. Only by aligning elite incentives with productive manufacturing will we achieve the structural transformation that has eluded the continent for years. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. You got through that very quickly. I appreciate it. So I have not seen any questions in the chat, but colleagues are welcome to raise their hands. We are slightly behind time. So if the all right, Elvis, please unmute yourself and ask.
No, thanks, Nakwanda. Quick question for Daniel. So I've seen a lot of work trying to do exactly what you're doing, and they come back to the same conclusion. And from a point of view, one common thread that they often ignore goes back to a point Faisal made in his keynote speech around the classic role the economic recovery programs and the strategic adjustment programs played in literally decimating industrial policy, industrial development interests, but also the capitalist states on the continent. And we've also seen how some of our forebears who had some of these interests literally being overthrown, right? So my point here is the factors that you identify to be important in explaining our lack of industrialization are all endogenous. How are we considering some of these endogenous factors so that we are actually explaining what led to some of these things rather than trying to look for factors that may not necessarily be explaining themselves? Thank you.
Right.
To answer your
Thanks. Hang on. Daniel, let's take the other question in the chat. This one is for Adesoji, which is why does dominance of services limit the effect of human capital on logistics? I am not seeing another one so far, so let's take Daniel and then move to Adesoji, and we'll take it from there.
To answer your question, yes, you are right. The structural adjustment program did play a big role with hindering industrialization, but I would like to move forward past that. I like to see reasoning in this the class that took over following colonialism. The class that took over following colonialism. This was the class that had the opportunity to shape things in Africa, but it's also extremely difficult, yes, to change and drive industrialization, specifically if your ideas are not supported by the people. That's why hence my research strictly focuses on states, or the role of the states. I think to drive and move forward past industrialization, it has to do with restructuring the role of the role of the states, and the role of the state involves the people in power. And if we can successfully remove or implement, or basically implement strict policies or motives to around the people of the state, then we can move forward in drive. Thank you.
Thanks, Daniel. Adesoji, and then Lodrina, I'm not sure if you're able to see the question in the chat. Maybe you can come in after Adesoji, and then we can look.
All right. Thank you. You know, why does dominance of service limit effect of human capital on logistics? I think the first has to do with the fact that logistics is tightly linked to goods rather than service. So we have the logistics system like transportation, warehousing, and supply chains. They are more physical than service. Then we also talk about there's some skill shifts, the shift in labor into non-logistic sector. Once educated workers tend to move into maybe finance, ICT, healthcare, and other ones, so than into logistics sector. Because usually there are also some lower demand for logistics intensive activities in terms of maybe bulk transport, warehousing, and other things. So I think these are some of the effects, some of the reasons, and even returns to human capital rather sector specific. So I think these are some of the reasons why the dominance of service, which limits the effect of human capital and logistics. Thank you.
Lodrina, can you please come in on the question on collaboration between innovation hubs in Zimbabwe? Is there evidence of that?
So thank you very much for that. Yes, there has been collaborations between innovation hubs in Zimbabwe. We actually do have projects that have translated nationally. For instance, we did a number plates project, which was across the various innovation hubs between tertiary and higher education units. However, I think it was also what I was trying to draw attention to in terms of the lessons learned, where I did mention that there are ecosystem issues that come into play that they tend to then impact on just how speedily industrial development will happen. And also knowing that the innovation hubs themselves are not exactly at the same level. So it's still an innovation ecosystem that needs time to mature, so that there is also a drive within the ecosystem, both from government, within the universities themselves, and as well across industry, to ensure that the playing field is more or less evened, and there's that progressive growth that is collaborative in nature. I think collaboration is key, and this is where technology transfer units are useful. So thank you.
All right, thank you. I think perhaps let's leave it there. There are some questions coming up in the chat, so the different speakers, please feel free to answer those in the chat. Thank you everyone for staying for this session, and I hope you will be staying for the next session as well. Thanks again for being here. I believe the next session, Baba is already online. Welcome.